Okay, today's webinar is DITA right for me, and our presenter is John Baker. John, it's all yours.
Thank you, Deborah. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar where we're taking a look about is DITA right for me? Now, this is really for anyone who has a basic understanding about DITA, and perhaps you're evaluating whether or not you think it might be a good option for your organization. Hopefully, we'll be able to shed some light on that question for you today. A little bit about myself. My name is John Baker. I'm a content marketing manager for Jorsic LLC, the makers of EasyDITA. Now, I really love this role because in this role, I get to really explore better ways to communicate technical, complicated concepts in more understandable ways and try to make them more accessible. And for these purposes, I get to create a lot of collateral, a lot of articles, webinars, white papers, case studies, a little bit of video more recently. And it's just something I really love doing, something I'm passionate about, and something I have a lot of fun with. Now, outside of work, I have a lot of hobbies. I'm a very passionate photographer. I've always got a camera either in my car or in my backpack. I really enjoy that, capturing those moments. I also have a really bad habit of buying too many books. And it's something that my wife regularly criticizes me about because I'll just black out and then I'll be walking out of a library sale with a stack full of books, and I don't know where they come from. But I do a pretty good job of reading most of those books, so I don't feel too guilty. I'm also a big Tottenham Hotspur football fan, so if there are any Chelsea fans in the audience, I'm really sorry about that thrashing we gave you over the weekend. And finally, I just really love spending time with my wife and 3 kids. We live up here in upstate New York, up in Rochester, New York, where we just received a fresh blanket of snow. So that is always a lot of fun. So a little bit about Jorsic real quick. We create EasyDITA, which is a single tool specifically designed for collaborative authoring, single source content management, and multi-channel publishing. So it's a DITA-based tool that sort of serves as an all-in-one from writing to publishing. But enough about me and Jorsic. Let's get on with this presentation. So just a little bit as we look at it. A quick look at how we'll be spending this afternoon. For those of you who attended our previous webinar that was held by my associate Rafi, he really went in depth into the question of what is DITA. If you haven't had the chance, I highly recommend you go back and check that out. I learned a few things from that presentation. It was really informative, really helpful. But for the sake of today, moving forward, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at DITA. But after that, we're going to transition into answering those questions about, is DITA a solution for your organization where it's at? So after we look at DITA, we're going to take some time, look at the problem for modern organizations, look at how DITA serves as the solution for those problems. And then we're going to take a step back and look at some considerations you need to take into account when you're weighing this decision about making that transition. We're also going to spend some time looking at company-wide collaboration, what that looks like in a healthy organization, and what tools are essential for that process. And then finally, we'll just go back as a quick summary and weigh some of those or review some of the pros and cons that we've already gone over in the presentation. So without further ado, let's dive in. What is DITA and why does it matter? So here at a really high level, I want to talk about language. Now, we as humans, we've developed more and more refined methods of communicating our thoughts. We develop these sounds, these grunts, these characters to write, and we use these things to convey ideas. We use them to convey emotions. We use them to convey desires. But it's really incredible when you think about it. The amount of nuance that's involved with some of these simple phrases is really quite amazing. But what about machines? Now, machines, they don't communicate through those means. They have a more restricted method of code. Now, this limitation means that there's an inherent barrier between the average individual and a machine. So how do we go about bridging this divide? The answer is structured authoring. Now, DITA is a specific type of structured authoring that was created by IBM back in 2001. A few years later, they went on to donate it as an open source architecture to OASIS, a committee that focused on maintaining and updating in the best interest of the community. So what are some of the drivers? Why do some companies see DITA as an answer? Now, there's a lot of factors, but one really big one is the ability to leverage company knowledge in a way that takes advantage of emerging technology. I want you to think about all of the latest trends. You know, it started accelerating back when we had the internet, and hopefully all of your companies are on the internet. I hope you all have websites and things of that nature. But it's progressed even more rapidly as time has gone on. We now have content that's specifically designed for mobile devices. We have chatbots, which need to actually be able to interact with humans in really understandable ways. And looking forward, other technologies that are becoming more and more accessible, such as virtual reality, augmented reality. And then as this spreads across the globe into an ever-increasing globalized economy and content automation. So DITA gives companies opportunities to leverage their knowledge through these technologies. And that's one of the big drivers that drives people to make this kind of a decision. But let's step back again and look at structured content. Now, the important thing to remember here is that DITA is a form of structured content or structured authoring. And that simply means that it is content written in a framework with a particular way of interpreting that structure. Now, we already use forms of structure in our everyday life. We have book formats that contain chapters, titles, body text, page numbers, etc. But these are just methods of creating consistency around language that we already use. So the text that we create has a structure, but it's harder to translate that into the language of machines. Now, in our everyday life, we do deal with the structured content, like I mentioned, but we use these visual cues, such as bold, italics, different font sizes, and things of that nature. And for humans, it's easy for us to see and interpret these visual differences, but that's not the case for machines. They can't associate the meaning behind the styling. So here we have a quote from the French philosopher Voltaire from his book Micromegas. I recently finished this book, actually, and I actually recently went over to Paris, and I was able to visit the Pantheon and visit the gravesite of Voltaire. So I highly recommend for anyone who happens to be traveling over there. But I thought this quote was comically appropriate for this discussion. So here we see it says, irregularity is inherent in our very nature. Expecting people to be perfectly wise is as crazy as putting wings on dogs or horns on eagles. Now you'll notice there are differences that are indicated visually. The title is larger font, the quote is placed in italics, the publication date is regular text, and the author is in bold. Now, here you can see that we've added the structured bits of code to the content to help the computer identify what each of these elements represent. These bits of code add semantic meaning to the text in a way that computers can be programmed to interpret and identify. Now, once these tags are added, it's easy for machines to be programmed to use the content like data instead of a block of unstructured text. These bits of codes are called semantic tags. We're going to talk just a little bit about semantic tagging and what that means. So just really simply with tags, there's typically an open tag or an enclosed tag. A lot of people are very familiar with this in the context of HTML. In much the same way, this just helps machines understand how to interpret. So here we have an example. It's not just text, but it's also images, video, any other type of medium you can tag, and computers know how to identify it. As long as there are tags, the computers will know what to do with it. So here we have this little image, and I've tagged it as a human. And that's all well and good. But a problem arises when someone else comes over and they try to tag maybe the same image. I see a human. Maybe you see a cowboy. Someone else might walk in. They might identify that as a person. So I think you're already starting to see this is one of the big problems that can arise if you don't have a standardization. This is where the SGML family tree comes into play. One of the early coding languages for this purpose of standardizing tags was SGML, which stands for Standard Generalized Markup Language. This was something that was implemented around the 60s, and there have been over 250 variations since that time. So you see on the left, you have HTML, and on the right, you have XML. HTML typically used for web applications, and you have the cascading style sheets or HTML5. But over on the other side, you see XML. Now, there are over 100 standards of XML, and I'm not going to go into all of those, but just to say that DITA is one of the most popular for technical publication standards, and it's agreed upon standard. So now, sorry. So you have a chance to see it. All right, so to recap, we know why we care about DITA, because it serves as that human-machine readable language interaction, and it allows us to create new technology, and it standardizes that into semantic tags. But what does DITA itself mean? So really quickly, I'm just going to go over these briefly and say that Darwin, in a nutshell, Darwin means higher hereditary attributes, or similar to Darwin's theory of evolution, elements inherit attributes from the parent element. Next, we have information, which is data or content or knowledge. We have typing, which is a classification of the information into topic types. Now, when you put those two together, information and typing, we have information typing, which is simply identifying the different types of topics that contain specific information. Understanding the difference between a concept topic, a task topic, and a reference topic. Those are the three primary types of topics. I'll go over those in just a moment. And finally, the A, which is for architecture. This is the structure necessary to arrange the elements. So DITA stands for Darwin, Information, Typing, Architecture, and all of these things revolve around content being created in a topic-based structure. So what traits do those topics have? So there are three primary types of topics. You have the concept topic, which presents essential conceptual or descriptive information so the reader can understand the background and context of a subject. You have the task topic, which provides the procedural information on how you do something, and a reference topic, which provides detailed facts or specifications, often in the form of a table or a bulleted list. And with each of these, it's important to understand the traits that I mentioned earlier. Topics all need to serve a purpose and be self-contained. They need to function modularly, and this means that any given topic should not depend on surrounding context in order to be understood. This is because these topics are the building blocks of your documentation. If authored properly, these topics are the foundation for your organization and how you can leverage it. So let me explain how that works. With topics as building blocks, you see we have the unstructured document, and we've turned that into a concept, a task, or a reference topic. So we've been able to take what was formerly unstructured and create these structure blocks. So now what? We need a way of connecting these topics back together so that when we want to build manuals or other publications, we can do this. And the way to do this is through DITA maps. Now, DITA maps are like a table of contents in that they link the information contained in one publication. A good example, you might think of a DITA map like a paper binder. It allows you to insert or reorder or remove different pages simply by snapping the clamps open. Unlike those paper binders though, DITA allows you to reuse those same topics in multiple locations. So here we see that the same topic types are used in both of these DITA maps. In Manual 1 and Manual 2, you can use almost the exact same set of topics, but maybe you have the inclusion of an additional task topic in that second manual. With DITA, and your content is authored in topics and reused in maps, you can use the same basic building blocks of content over and over. The more you publish, the more you save. So I mentioned we were going to talk about DITA at a really high conceptual, at a really high perspective. Now I want to encourage you, if your head is spinning, I know that was a lot of content that we just went over really fast. I would definitely encourage you to go and watch my associate's webinar on the question of what is DITA. But for the sake of time, we're going to keep moving here, and we're going to look at the problem for the modern organization. So the problem for the modern company is that content demands only increase. I've never heard a tech writer complain that there were lower and lower expectations in terms of document output. But why is this? As demands increase, it seems like capacity rarely, if ever, is able to keep up. Now, there are many factors at play here, but I want to focus on two that I think are especially prevalent in this context. The first one is complexity. Now, if you were to stop and ask my grandfather about something like car repair, you'll hear a story and he'll tell you about back in the good old days back in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, you'd be able to pop open the hood of a vehicle, look at it, see how all those mechanical parts interact. You could listen to it, you could feel it, it was tactile, and it just made sense. You could diagnose a problem and you could fix it. It would take some elbow grease, it would take some hard work, but you could understand it. Now, he's told me, I asked him for advice on something regarding my car, and he was just honest with me, and he was like, you need a computer to be able to diagnose what's happening inside of a car these days. And that's just a reflection of this complexity. Now, I want to add the caveat that there is an ongoing discussion about whether the world is more complex or about whether we've just become more aware of the existing complexity. I kind of want to table that for now, because in this context and in the role of organizations and specifically technical communicators, there absolutely is an increase in complexity. And that's for three primary reasons. The first is the products. The products that they're writing technical documentation for are becoming more complicated, especially when you look at the fields of software and technology. These products are just simply becoming more complicated, and there's a higher expectation about what they need to cover in these items. Next is the authoring tools are becoming increasingly complicated. It's not just enough to be able to put your content into a Word document, and that's that. You have to use more and more tools to be able to accomplish the tasks that are necessary for these products, and also to accomplish the tasks that come along with output expectations. As things go along, customers expect more and more advanced forms of publishing for the documentation. And I think everyone has seen this. Like we talked about earlier, one of the major drivers for DITA is this advancement in technology and expectation. So I also wanted to close this point on complexity with a quote I really appreciate by the computer scientist. I'm going to butcher his name, but I believe it's pronounced Dijkstra, I believe he was a Dutch computer scientist. And he states that simplicity is a great virtue, but it requires hard work to achieve it and education to appreciate it. And to make matters worse, complexity sells better. So we've talked about complexity. Another factor that I think brings this demand to the forefront is simply production growth. Just by nature of a marketplace economy, successful companies expand. And as they expand, you see an increased product breadth and product depth. Additionally, with these new products, you'll also see geographic expansion, more demands for translation, there's just simply more things to consider. And so when you take all this into account, you have to multiply the factors of complexity by the factors of production growth. And the end result is just an increasing demand upon the tech writers in this space. So, but what does this mean? We've seen how this affects a company as a whole. What does this mean actually for the activities that tech writers deal with on a day-to-day basis? So we split this up into four primary domains, so to speak. We have authoring, managing, publishing, and scaling. Now with scaling, I know that might not be specific to technical writers. That might be something felt more company-wide, but technical writers are absolutely on the forefront of those scalability questions. So first, we want to talk about the opportunity cost in terms of authoring. And now I say we're talking about opportunity cost because this is not simply a discussion about dollars and cents. A lot of these organizations are going to run into obstacles, and it's not simply a matter of spending money to overcome those obstacles. In a lot of cases, it's a matter of spending resources, of time, of simple opportunity costs that's spent on some obstacles versus being able to designate that to more fruitful endeavors. But so first, we're going to look at some of the big things that cost writers in the realm of authoring. One of the big ones is that as the company expands, the product breadth expands, it's more and more difficult to maintain consistency between documentation. So companies will end up spending time and money on training, reviews, revisions. It becomes a ever increasing demand on the company. And another thing is that we actually, something we found from a recent survey that we conducted is that our respondents reported that they spent 11 hours a week just maintaining their existing documentation. Now, I want to be clear here that maintaining documentation is a part of the job, and it is a good thing. But in a lot of these instances, we see that writers report that they're spending too much time updating or maintaining documentation when that effort would be better spent in other realms, be it creating new documentation or coming up with new and creative ways to leverage the existing documentation, or even just about planning and strategizing and being forward thinking as opposed to always playing catch up on what was already written. Another area of opportunity cost within the authoring realm is that there's simply a lot of duplicated content that occurs. Now, when this happens, sometimes it can come in the form of copying and pasting. And I know in the short term, when you copy and paste, it seems like a net win, like you've saved time. But over the long run, as you copy and paste, you'll find that the overhead and the frustration associated with updating all of those instances of copying and pasting become a whole separate headache all in and of itself. So you see that with duplicating content and effort and then updating that. In a very similar fashion, you'll have content that is very similar between products, but because there's like nuanced differences, organizations have to essentially rewrite that documentation. And then finally, we see that in some cases, there's exact content that's duplicated, but it's so entangled in the surrounding documentation that either they're not aware of it or it becomes so much of a hassle to try to remove it and reuse it. So moving on, let's look at some of the opportunity costs within managing that content. I want to talk a little bit about siloed information, or that information that's inaccessible. I know talking about siloed information is a little bit of a buzzword in a lot of the business world, but it is a real problem that a lot of organizations face. There was a recent survey from e-consultancy, I believe, that found that about 40% of companies report significant issues with their interdepartment silos. I think the language in there said that they believed that they were hindered from meeting customer expectations because different departments with siloed information had different agendas. That's at a company-wide level. When you get down to it, even within the same department, you can have serious issues with siloed content, be it some writers who have content on their hard drive that they don't know about or they haven't shared with the rest of the organization. Content that is siloed is essentially worthless to the rest of the organization. Now, for some information, it's not necessarily siloed, but it's hard to find. This is content that might be stored in different documents, or it might not be tagged properly, or it might just be something that isn't titled properly and people don't know where to find it. So in the same way that inaccessible content is essentially useless, content that is accessible but impossible to find is also useless. There was a recent study from McKinsey that found that interaction workers, they spend about 19% of their day searching for existing content. That's almost 20% of their day spent just trying to find the content that they've already written within the organization. That is a staggering number. And moving on to the next level, we see this versioning nightmare. That question, what is the latest version of this document? And this next graphic, I have just a little bit of an illustration, kind of tell a personal story with this versioning nightmare. One of my older jobs, I came from, I was a marketing manager at another role, and part of my job was interacting with the technical team. And so I would work and I would design a document in InDesign. And then they didn't have InDesign, so I'd print it off into a PDF and I'd hand it in over to them. And so I'd take this initial document and then hand it over to them, one or maybe two reviewers, and they might review it, they might, combine it and give it back to me, but they also might end up sending it off to someone else for an additional review. And they might not merge those corrections into the same document. And it would start to get emailed, and it would start to get spread around, and the file name might change in the case of a digital file. And before you know it, someone says, hey, where's the latest document on this subject? And you're just left with the question of which one is the final version? I don't know. And there isn't a good answer because maybe all of these documents have different aspects to them that there's value that's been added by the reviewers, but you just don't know which one is the final anymore. So now moving on, let's talk about opportunity costs with publishing. Now, one of the big things with publishing is that as the company expands and they have more publishing output, there's the problem of maintaining consistent styling. We did a recent survey, and we found that, at least with our respondents, they indicated that formatting and trying to keep the styling of this published document, those tasks associated with that, it was one of their least valuable activities. I think second least activity, second to maybe copying and pasting. And so this is something that a lot of writers are spending a lot of time on, and they don't believe it's actually adding any value to the organization. Now, in a lot of cases, you have a lot of duplicates for each audience type. Maybe you have multiple different product brochures based on what's going out to which customers. And when that happens, you have to spend a lot of time doing the formatting, setting up for publishing. There's a recent study that found that for Microsoft Office users, sometimes 30 to 50% of that document creation time was just spent on publishing format. Now, this is a lot of time that adds up very quickly within the organization. And next, we're going to look at scaling. So with scaling, what we're talking about is essentially as the company grows and they want to expand, the demands upon the team will increase. And so required output will increase. And you want to be strategic about the way that you try to meet that increase in demand. So one of the big things for scaling company is that there's a costly translation and localization process, especially if you're expanding into new markets. I just want to make the quick note about translation and localization. It's something that comes up a lot. What's the difference between the two? And without being too reductionist about it, to my understanding, translation is something where it's a word for word. You have that exact translation that occurs. But really, that's not enough for most technical documentation. You have to have localization, which is where you actually make that document appropriate for the audience based on their language and their specific set of needs. And this is one of the top expenses when it comes to expanding to new markets for organizations. Now, another aspect of scaling is the importance of having file standardization. You want to have documents that are, or file formats that are future-proof that you can use in the future. And you want to avoid having issues with software differences across your company, especially with a scaling or growing company, especially if you have acquisition of other companies. Having a having a default software is really important when you're looking at the organization as it expands. So now we've looked at some of those opportunity costs and some of those obstacles and how different companies are struggling to overcome them. So I want to talk about how DITA offers a solution to that. So we're going to go back through some of these points that we brought up, and we're just going to look at how DITA can address these problems and offer a solution to those headaches. So when it comes to something like we mentioned earlier about the consistency that happens between documents, that, as we talked about earlier, DITA, when it's done properly, is authored in a topic-based, context-free manner. You're really creating the building blocks for your company. And so rather than having to worry about this consistency between documents having proper tone, you'll actually end up reusing a lot of these same building blocks in powerful and creative ways that can reduce the amount of time actually spent creating those documents. And additionally, it really, if you have everyone trained properly in the way to author this content, it brings on this non-contextual, consistent tone that's very helpful, very straightforward, and easy to understand for authors. Next, we're going to look at, for authoring, you have duplicated or content effort. Now, content reuse really deserves its own webinar, and we've actually hosted webinars about it in the past. And you'll see at the resources section at the end of this webinar that there's some resources about getting your head around content reuse, because it really is a big thing, and it's a really powerful feature built into DITA that lets you take those building blocks and use them across your organization and see huge returns on that investment. But I don't want to go into all of that right now just for the sake of time. Just to say that those issues of copying and pasting and trying to find what matches should be used where are reduced or eliminated when you have a proper reuse strategy in place. Talking about managing, I know we talked about siloed information, or the information that's inaccessible to the rest of your organization. With a proper DITA CCMS, you have a single source of truth. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about a single source of truth in just a minute. But really, What that functions as is a centralized repository that is an authority on all your documentation. So no one's going to ask, where is this document? Everyone knows that it's located in the single source in this CCMS. And also within that CCMS, within that single source of truth, you have increased findability because your DITA topics are tagged with metadata. And if done properly, if executed well, you have really rich tagged content with lots of different methods of findability. I often liken it to an Amazon store or another e-commerce store, where you'll have the typical keyword search at the top, but you can also have different methods of sorting along the side. So on Amazon, you'll have things like the maybe different brands, price range, star rating. You can have similar methods of categorizing your content within your CCMS, whether it be the author, where it is in a workflow process, and different things of that nature. It just really makes finding your content a lot more simple, and everyone knows where to look. And finally, versioning. Like I mentioned with that single source, you have a central repository. So no one says which one is the final version, because the final version is the version that is in your single source. So now moving on, talking about publishing. Now this is where a lot of the power of DITA is really on display. With publishing, we talked a lot about that inconsistent styling. But if you take the time and you preset those configurations for styling output, you'll have consistent and automatic output. The beauty of DITA is that you don't do the styling in the authoring process. The authoring and the styling are divorced from one another, and all of those, the visual elements, all of that styling is actually applied to the content on output. So rather than your authors having to spend a lot of time making sure that the document looks right, all those things are handled on output if you set those configurations beforehand. And this can be used over and over and over. So like with other things, the more you publish, the more you save. Next, talk about when we mentioned that there are many duplicates for each audience type. One thing that's really powerful about DITA is that you have this multi-channel push button publishing once your configurations are set ahead. But another really cool feature about it is that there's also the opportunity for conditionalized content. Now, one thing we practice at Easy DITA is that we actually do have conditionalized content even within the same map. And what that means is that you get to tag different sections for a specific audience. So we might have one map that is comprised of multiple topics, but some sections we might have tagged for internal only or customer facing only and things of that nature. So then when someone is going and publishing it, they essentially just select which audience that publication is going to be intended for, and the published document will only render the appropriate content based on who the intended audience is. So rather than having multiple different documents for different audiences, you can have one document and then have each section tagged for the appropriate audience and publish that way. It saves a lot of time and a lot of headache. So now moving on from publishing, we're going to look at how DITA as a solution can affect your scaling of your company. Now, when we talk about localization, just one of the big things to remember is that with DITA, just like we talked about with publishing, there's no formatting. Scriptorium, they recently reported that they found that for a lot of organizations, by taking out that formatting and using DITA, you can reduce the cost of localization by 30 to 50% per document. For companies that are expanding to new markets, that adds up really fast. And then finally, with DITA, you do have a standard file type. Your content is standardized across your organization, and it's future-proofed as compared with unstructured file types. So now we've had a chance to look at how DITA serves as a solution to so many of these headaches and these growing pains that companies face with increasing demand on their tech writers. But we also want to look at some of the considerations, some of the things that it's important to keep in mind when it comes to making the decision about whether DITA is right for your organization. So one of the first things is talking about the importance of training. It's really important that we train writers to avoid things like contextual dependency. So here I have an example where it says in the previous chapter or something of that nature. That doesn't work in DITA because with DITA, in order to reuse these building blocks, you need each building block to be able to stand on its own. It has to answer a singular question, that question alone, so that it can be used in different instances. Another thing that needs to be trained is to maintain that consistent tone. Every topic should serve a purpose and fit wherever it's needed, just like we said in terms of contextual dependency. Next, it's important that there's training about proper reuse implementation. A lot of organizations who jump into DITA without a proper reuse strategy, they feel the pain of that later on. It's really important that you understand the different types of reuse, when those things are appropriate, and when it's best to use them to get the most out of your DITA implementation. And like I said, reuse is a very significant aspect of DITA, and so I highly recommend you look at some of the other resources that we've listed at the end of the presentation in regards to that. And then finally, training in regards to content management. How is your organization going to plan and organize the way your content is structured around DITA? Another important consideration is about content conversion. When you move your content, you're taking it from an unstructured setting to a structured environment. This can be done in-house or with a consultant, and that really is a question about how much you might have and what kind of changes you think will need to be done. There's always this discussion about whether you should do a pre-conversion or a post-conversion cleanup with your files. And generally what I've seen with best practice is that if you have documents that you use regularly and you're involved with a lot, generally you want to do a pre-conversion cleanup. And this pre-conversion cleanup doesn't have to be all bad. Actually, it can be a really exciting opportunity to identify different opportunities for reuse. And so going through, looking for different instances where you see content that could be applied in different situations. You might find some exact matches in those cases. You know that this is something that you reuse regularly and you don't really need to change anything about it. That's perfect. It'll save you a lot of time. In other cases, you'll find something that we refer to as a fuzzy match, which is something that's close and with a little bit of tweaking can be used regularly for different reuse instances. And then finally, for a consideration for that content conversion is just understanding the different topic types and how you want to arrange your existing content into those types. Now, another consideration is understanding when to consider a consultant. Now, this is a complicated question, and it really depends on your individual use case, what you're looking to do with it, where you want to go with it. But generally, we recommend that you should consider working with a DITA consultant if your plan includes highly customized or dynamic publishing outputs, extensive legacy content conversions, you want to implement a streamlined translation process, or perhaps you're dealing with a complex taxonomy. In those instances, definitely recommend that you at least take a look at using a DITA consultant. And then another thing, a big one, when it comes to considerations for DITA implementation is understanding the productivity dip. Now, during the transition, there will be a dip in productivity while your writing team has to adjust to the change. This is something natural, but it's still something that can be a little bit painful for an organization if they haven't planned accordingly. This dip definitely needs to be planned. And so here I have two illustrations that we see sometimes with different organizations as when it comes to implementing DITA as a reaction to a foreseen increase in required output. So on the left graph, you see there's an organization, and the yellow line indicates their production, and the blue line indicates the required output. And there's that increase in required output. This might be because of there's a new product that's coming out or expanding to a new market, whatever the case may be. The team knows that in the near future, more is going to be expected of them. And so this left side, they reacted a little bit late. They waited till the pressure was right upon them. And so this dip actually happened at the same time as the increase in required output. And it results in a lot of pain, a lot of frustration. Now on the right side, we see the team that was more proactive in their approach. They saw the required output. They knew that their organization as it currently stood wouldn't be able to handle that increased output. So they took advantage of the time that they had, and they made that transition to DITA so that the dip would happen before. But as that output increase set in, they were coming out of that DITA transition. And so they had a really exciting period where they got to have production output that went alongside this required output increase. So now I want to take a very quick moment and for the sake of time, just take a brief moment to talk about company-wide collaboration as it relates to DITA. Now, we typically see in organizations that there are some primary barriers to collaboration that occurs. You'll see that sometimes it's because work is done outside of the tool set. Just like the example I gave from my old organization, we were working from different tools. And so the changes that were made weren't uniform. They became a headache, and it just resulted in confusion, chaos, frustration, and a little bit of weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's one of the major barriers to collaboration. Another one is a lack of training. Something we've talked about. It's important that the whole team is on the same playing field and that they understand what's expected of them and that they're equipped with the tools to make it happen. Another thing is file locking. Just a reality that if you want multiple people to be able to actually collaborate at the same time, you need to be able to work in a space without file locking. And then finally, workflow tracking, understanding whose responsibility it is at what stage in the workflow so that your workflow continuously is always moving and you don't have these bottlenecks that always seize up. So when we talk about these barriers, we've talked about DITA, I want to spend just a little bit more time looking at a single source of truth and how this is pivotal in the way that your organization can actually collaborate. We've talked a little bit about it, but there's just a huge importance to having a central content repository. You save a lot of time searching. If you have properly metadata infused content, then you don't have to spend that 19 to 20%. When you actually multiply that out by labor statistics, that 20% for a lot of workers can be approximately about $10,000 per employee annually. That's just spent trying to find that existing information that you've already created. So with a single source of truth, I don't want to say you entirely eliminate that, but you greatly reduce the amount of time and the amount of money that's spent just trying to track down files that should be on hand. Next, with a single source of truth, you're actually able to streamline workflows. You have people who are all working within the same system, so it boosts the efficiency of writing, editing, approving, and you can do all of these things in a shared single tool. And finally, allows you to control versioning. Like we talked about again with that little personal anecdote of mine. Controlled versioning allows you to prevent documents from multiplying with different incorrect versions. You have authority, you have control over the documents, and you prevent them from spawning into confusing variants. Now next, I just want to take a few brief moments and talk about some of the key aspects of effective collaboration. And this is more about the tool set that you use. And these are aspects of the tools that we see being used by individuals in the organization. If these tools have these features, generally they work very well for collaboration. One of the primary things is the importance of a familiar interface or a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get editor. Now, the importance of this is that if it's just for your tech team, the interface, it still matters, but the interface, if it's a tool that you're trained in, it's not going to scare off a lot of your writers. However, if you want company-wide collaboration, the appearance of that editing interface can possibly scare off reviewers. We've heard a lot of stories. I've heard a lot of stories of writers who talk about they just need this SME, the subject matter expert. They just need them to sign off on something to review it, but it takes them so long. And from the subject matter expert's perspective, you can understand it if it's a very complicated tool and it's a headache to get in. Maybe you have to ask for a walkthrough every time you need to go in and review something. That makes it really difficult, very frustrating for those editors to go in. So it's important that this is a familiar interface, something that they feel at home in. Another important aspect is change tracking and comments. Now with change tracking and comments, very similar to how Google Docs worked, except it's in a structured environment as opposed to an unstructured. You can have editors who can add their feedback, add their comments, add their suggestions, but then you have your editors who are actually able to go through and either approve or reject those changes. Another really important trait is having assignments and workflows. Now, it's really important, whatever your existing workflow is, one of the big keys to that is that it's something that's transparent, it's visible, so everyone understands their role, and that it's something where it's really easy to track and assign. So this is a screenshot from DITA where it can tell you down in the bottom left, you see right there, you see a very simple workflow for author, review, approve. And you can have whichever individuals are responsible for those tasks, you have that information there. So everyone knows at what stage it's at and how to move the production forward. So no one's left saying, I thought it was your turn to deal with the document or something of that nature. Next, this is something that a lot of DITA editors offer, but have tools that are dedicated for your reviewers to make their work easier. So here's another screenshot from our editor, and you'll see that the editor or the reviewer, they're able to go in and they have this pop-out widget that just allows them to jump between topics, open comments, or assigned materials easily. And then finally, something that is just a reality of that's just a reality when it comes to collaboration is the importance of not having file locking and, if possible, being able to do real-time collaboration with multiple authors or reviewers working in it at the same time. Now, full disclosure, this is something that at this time DITA does offer. I don't think a lot of DITA editors do offer this, or we might be the only ones on the market right now who do. But I just want to talk about it because it is an important aspect of collaborating within your organization. You need to be able to have multiple individuals working on documents at the same time. So now we're just going to go back really quickly. We've had a chance to look about the problems that companies are experiencing, how those problems are pushed upon the writers and the frustration that they have to deal with, how those problems can be solved through the use of an effective DITA implementation, also looking at different considerations that need to be taken into account before moving to a DITA implementation. So I just want to review really quickly some of those things that we went over. So first, looking at the pros, or as we framed them, solutions. Some of the big ones that we talked about with DITA, you have modular, topic-based building blocks of content. You have opportunity for significant cost savings through content reuse. Now, on this point, if you've had a chance, I recommend looking, I can't remember the author's name, but I have it referenced in our resources, but a book about DITA metrics and appreciating how with just a few instances of reuse, you can cut your editing, or you can cut your document production time in half in some instances, just with a few instances of reuse. Another one of these solutions that DITA offers is that single source of truth, something we've talked a lot about. And within that single source of truth, you have this metadata infused driven search that allows you to find your content and allows you to find your content, be able to identify it, and actually use it. You don't have those versioning nightmares. Another big solution that DITA offers is in the form of publishing. You have consistent styling. You don't have to deal with the headache of formatting. Once those configurations are set, you're good to go. And then you have conditional content for different audience types. And then finally, in terms of solutions as it relates to scaling, you have those significant savings on localization cost and standardized file types across your organization. So now going back to the cons or the considerations, these considerations are all really important to take into account before you make any sort of jump to a DITA system. One of the big ones that we talked about was training. This is something that should not be taken lightly. It's really important that everyone in your organization actually understands what is going on when it comes to a DITA implementation. They have proper training for writing, organizing, and planning your content structures. Another one is the content conversion. Deciding what kind of tool, or if you work with actually a conversion organization, it's something that should be understood, and it really depends on an individual basis based upon how much legacy content you might need to convert. Next, we have the consideration of consultation. Really, like we talked about, understanding when you should consider a consultant. And again, that really depends on your use case. And then finally, the productivity dip. And this is the one that is the hardest for a lot of organizations to swallow. And the last thing you should do, especially if you're talking to management, the last thing you should do is try to breeze over this point or ignore it, because that's only going to result in pain down the road. But in terms of that productivity dip, understanding the timing of it and the limitations during that timing, how it will hamstring the writing team for that period, but understanding what the other side has to offer. So with that, here are some of the resources that I really encourage you to check out and to further your education with the PDF that will be attached after the webinar in that email. You should be able to click on the links to check out all of these resources. Gives you a little bit of background, going back to introduction of DITA, beginner reuse in DITA. Also has some helpful pages about how to reuse structured content and different things of that nature. Here's also some of the resources if you're interested. I know I named some, or I listed a lot of stats in here. If you want to learn more about those stats, this is the place to find them. And so with that, I want to thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. And that's it.
We'll just give it a couple of minutes for last coming in questions. So a few questions did come in. How do you handle reuse when going from unstructured content to DITA?
I'm sorry, what was that?
The question was, how do you handle reuse when going from unstructured content to DITA?
So when it comes to reuse and you're going from an unstructured to a structured, it really is about having that new mindset about what DITA is when you're looking at your content. So one thing, if I'm to use an example of my old organization, we had a lot of instances where there was very similar content across a lot of our product documentation that was also reused in our website, but they weren't exact matches because they were authored at different times for slightly different purposes. But when you're doing that pre-conversion cleanup, it's important to go through all of those critically and understand what are the things that it's very similar intent or messaging, and try to set those up to be your kind of cornerstone, or what we do in our organization, we call them warehouse topics, which is where we have them kind of set aside and they're referenced in multiple different publications. So that's one of the big things I recommend. And also, your content better than anyone else. So it's important that you understand in what instances that's the best case to move forward.
Another question, someone said, I work for a relatively small organization with no formal writing group. How can I determine if DITA is right for us?
So for a relatively small organization with no formal writing group, sometimes DITA simply isn't the answer. But really the question isn't so much about the team, although that is a factor. but it's also about your outputs. If you are creating content for multiple different publishing outputs, if you have translation to consider, or if you find yourself reusing the same content across multiple different instances, then DITA is definitely something to consider. So I would definitely encourage looking at those factors most critically.
And the last question that came in, where do you find DITA consultants for organizations?
So we actually have a few partners that we work with regularly. They serve as terrific DITA consultants, one of which is Scriptorium, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. Another one is Precision Content. But in a lot of instances, it can depend on your use case. So one thing is that it's really hard for us to always determine who the best consultant is for your specific use case. So if you want to contact EasyDITA, for instance, based on your specific instance, we can help you figure out which is the best consultant to go from there.
Another question that came in, is it better to do a moving forward implementation or to try to include legacy content?
That's a tricky question, and the answer is a very unsatisfying, it depends. So it really depends about how much do you have invested in that legacy content? Is it something that you'll be able to parse through, or is it something that maybe for your organization you don't have a lot invested in legacy content, in which case it might just be better to do a moving forward implementation, and then as things arise where you want to take from that legacy content, add it back in. So for pretty much every larger organization that has a lot invested in their existing content, it's probably best to do some form of a legacy content conversion. But for smaller, newer companies without a lot invested in their existing content, maybe a moving forward implementation is the right answer. It really depends.
Okay, those were all the questions that I see that came in. So thank you very much, John. That was a great webinar. And thank you to everyone who attended. We do have more webinars coming up, so please check out our education page on our website at stc.org. And remember, an email is coming your way shortly that will have a link to the recording of today's webinar as well as a link to an evaluation. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you.